Legends of Swift. We've got an array of big learning in this video. We're going to be covering Xcode Playgrounds. We'll learn how to use the REPL to test and experiment with code. We'll give you an introduction to arrays. We'll talk about declaring, initializing, and adding and removing elements from arrays. We'll talk about moving code from playgrounds to projects, and we'll give more tips on debugging and executing apps. So let's get at it! So what we're going to do right now is we're going to take a little detour from working in an Xcode project. Now what we've been doing up until this point is building apps using a compiler, and the compiler is critical. What it does is it takes all the files that we have in our project, and when we click on build and run, it packages them all up and it puts them in a format that can be executed in the simulator on an iOS device. But unfortunately, it can take a while to compile, but sometimes you want to test out and experiment with some simple Swift logic without having to build out a whole iOS interface. You wish you could just type some code and see the results in real time. Well, Xcode's got a great feature called Xcode Playgrounds that we can use for this. Let's go start one up. Now, even though I'm in a project right now, I could shut down the project because Playgrounds exist separately from projects. And just a side note, Apple also uses the product name Playgrounds. The Swift Playgrounds app on the iPad, that's a completely different product. It's a great little learning tool, but it's not part of Xcode. Now, I'm going to keep my project up because I'm going to show you it's really handy to be able to test some things in the playground and then copy and paste them back into our code. And you can add a playground file to a project, but I want you to think about these things as separate. So in order to start a new playground, I'm going to go up into the File menu, I'm going to select New, and Playground is one of the options. And it opens a window here with some of the familiar choices, so I'm going to select iOS and blank, click on Next. It asks me where I want to save this, so I'm just going to save it to the desktop. And since we're going to be talking about arrays, I'm just going to call this Array Playground. Playgrounds can be a nice place to put in some coding notes and pull them up later on. You'll also notice we weren't asked for an option to create a Git repository. That's because most playgrounds are sort of scratch pads, and that's different from the full-blown app projects with multiple files that we've been previously building in Xcode. But if you wanted to, you could get in, create your own repo, and manually drag over those files. You can also add files to a project too, but again, they're scratch pads, so you usually don't. So I'll expand this to full screen, and we see when you start a new iOS playground, you get this import statement for UIKit here, and we have a rather useless string variable. Now we know it's a string variable because we can see the double quotes and the text color is red, but if you option click on top of str, we get the pop-up box that says this is a string variable. Now an Xcode Playground is what's called a REPL, R-E-P-L in capital letters. It's an acronym that stands for Read, Evaluate, and Print Loop. And the REPL can execute our results in real time or near real time and show us the results right away. So let's get into it and take a tour. Now if your REPL looks a little bit different up here, remember you've got icons in the upper right-hand corner where you can expose or hide the navigators. Down here, you'll see either a triangle play button or a square stop button. It's just a toggle. This is where we can execute our code in the REPL. If you hold your cursor down, you get a couple of options in here too, including automatically run or manually run. Manually run is a pretty good option to use because if you do automatically run, Xcode will constantly check to see if you've got any code updates. This can tax your battery life, so manual run makes sense. Now in order to execute, you can just click the stop button and play again. It might take a little while for Xcode to think through the very first time you use a playground, but over here on the right side we see a results pane. And you see the word Hello Playground shows up to reflect the fact that the variable we have over here now has Hello Playground in it. Now you can click and you can drag and expand this if you want to see more stuff over here on the side. You'll also notice if you move your cursor over, you get a quick look eye. If you click on that, a little box pops up. Click outside the box, it'll go away. This rectangle here, if you hover over, will show the results in line, and we can see right down here it says Hello Playground underneath. Most of the time what I do though is I'll just use a print statement. So watch when I type in print and open parentheses. You'll also notice code completion shows up. I'll select str and press return. Xcode conveniently writes the closing brace. And now to execute my code, I've got a few options. I can move my cursor over here to one of the line numbers, and the line number turns into a play button. If I click the play button, it'll execute all the code through that line. If I want to execute all the code in the REPL, I can go down to the lower left-hand corner of this window, and there'll either be a play button or a stop button where you can click and then click play. That'll execute all the code, or the technique you'll probably use most often is just to type shift return at the end of the line. That'll execute everything through that line. So now I'm going to change the contents of my str variable to, how about, dang, you Swifty. And then I press shift return. We can see the result on the right-hand side in the results pane. And if you want, you can go down here and type in print str again, and we see the updated results in the console with our new print statement. So near real-time results. Nice. Now before we continue, it's worth mentioning that Xcode Playgrounds are not necessarily the most reliable part of the IDE. Crashes and hangs in Playgrounds can be pretty common. In fact, just as I was preparing material for this video, Xcode Playgrounds crashed on me 3 times, and I'm using a production version of Xcode. This brings up a couple of quick tips. It's really smart for you as a developer to restart your Mac every now and then. I know it's common for a number of folks to just sleep their machine, but when you do a complete restart of your Mac, what that'll do is it'll clear out the RAM, and in case you had any errant extensions or other programs that were muddying things up in ways that you couldn't detect, it'll just decrease the chances of those kinds of errors. Developers might have different opinions. I usually try to completely restart my Mac once every day or two. Now, another problem you'll probably encounter that can be really frustrating is sometimes it seems that Xcode just hangs and it won't run your code. This is due to an ongoing quirk in having Xcode Playground work and communicate with some of the other things necessary for iOS. Now, this technique I'm going to show you will work great if you're just working with Swift and you're not using Playgrounds for anything like displaying the iOS interface. And throughout our tutorials, that's what we're going to do. We're not going to be creating buttons or user interface layout in Playgrounds. So if you're finding that your Playground hangs on you, use this technique. So while in Playgrounds, go to the upper right-hand corner and expose the inspectors pane. And the inspector that should show up is identity and type. And instead of platform iOS, if you say platform Mac OS, that's all the selection we need, so you can hide the inspectors. And if you wait long enough, Xcode will give you an error at this import UIKit statement. That's because UIKit is the special software library that we're adding to work with iOS. But because we just switched to Mac OS, the iOS stuff doesn't work with the Mac. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to replace import UIKit with import Playground support, upper camel case. Hopefully, you'll find that your Playground executes faster and you don't get the hangs you may have been experiencing. You can also try quitting and restarting Xcode. So I'm just going to do a Shift-Enter right now. Xcode will think for a little while, I get the running message, and everything is looking good. So that was our Playground tutorial. I'll get rid of these lines that we had up here. We don't need them. And what I'll do is I'll toggle back to our project. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab these three statements here, the let statements, just to show you, paste them in here, uncomment them, Control-I fixes the indentation, and I've got these three statements up here, and if I do a Shift-Enter, it executes. Now, if I wanted to create different statements, I would have to create different let constants, and that can be tedious. So I'm going to show you a technique called arrays, which is one value, one constant or variable, that's inside going to hold multiple values in a sort of ordered list, and we'll be able to access each one of those values through an index. Let's give it a try. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create this new value. I'm going to call it messages, and inside of here, after the equal sign, I'm going to start with an open bracket. Now, an open bracket means you're going to start this array, which is this ordered list, and then you just add your array elements, separating each one by a comma. So since we want to have an array of strings, I'll type in a bunch of strings. Each one will be between double quotes, and I'll have commas separating them. So here we go, and feel free to type in your own phrases. I'm going to put in 4. You are awesome. You are great. You are fantastic and fabulous. That's you. All those strings are in quotes. And we've closed with a square bracket. So it recognizes that these are 4 strings, there are commas separating them. Now let's see what happens if we go and we say print messages. First of all, code completion recognizes messages, but the bracket around string means that this is an array of values of type string, and arrays can be empty with 0 elements up to many, many thousands of elements. So I want to select this array of strings named messages, so I'm going to press return, then I'm going to do a shift return to execute my code. And in the console area, we see the array is printed out. It's got brackets around it. There are all of our strings separated by commas. Also notice this string at the end, fabulous, that's you, that has an apostrophe in it. That apostrophe or single quote is going to print with a slash in front of it in the console. But if you use this as part of the text attribute of a label, for example, you wouldn't have this extra character in your app. Now we have 4 elements in this array. You are awesome, you are great, you are fantastic, fabulous, that's you. If we want to get at a single element in here, we can just say print messages, an open bracket, and then give it the number of the element that we want. And we refer to that number as the index of the element. So I'm going to say 1 in here, close the square bracket, and then make sure that I've got a close parenthesis after print, do Shift Enter, and whoa, it says you are great down here. Now the reason it says you are great, that's the second element. You might be wondering, hey, but I put in a 1 in here. Well, computers typically start counting at 0. We say that arrays are 0 indexed, and you'll find this is the case on just about any other programming language you use. So if we wanted to get you are awesome, we could type in print messages 0, Shift Enter, you are awesome. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. So our 4th element is fabulous, that's you. What would happen if we type in print messages 4? Shift Enter, we get a fatal error index out of range. And the reason for that is since it starts at 0, this is 1, this is 2, this is 3, we don't have a 4. So I'm going to change 4 to 3, Shift Enter, and we see fabulous, that's you. Nice. Now there are a whole host of different functions and values that we can access on anything that's an array. So for example, we've got messages here. If I type in print messages dot, the dot notation shows up all of these different values, and the M stands for method. We'll learn more about that in a future video, but essentially those are functions that operate on the value. I'm going to type in count and look what shows up. It gives me the number of elements in an array. So I'll do Shift Enter here. It tells me I've got 4 elements. So one of the things that you could do if you wanted to show the last element in an array is you could say print messages bracket and then do inside the bracket messages.count with the close bracket and the close parenthesis. So what this will do is it will find out how many elements there are in here and put the value in messages. Now if I do this, I'm going to get an error. Why am I getting an error? Pause, see if you can figure it out. So we're now pausing and we'll resume. Oh yeah. Messages.count is 4, but the last element is 3. How could you fix this? See if you can figure it out. Pause. Resume. You can go in here and do a little bit of math. So we could say messages.count -1, press enter, and whoa, we fixed that. And we'll use this technique several times, subtracting 1 from the overall number of values so that we can fix for 0 indexing. Nice. Now, can we change elements in the array? We can. We'll run into a problem. Do you remember why? So first what I'm going to do is if I want to say, how about messages dot, and I can say remove, and look at what the option is up here with code completion. And again, Xcode is amazing. It provides you with documentation. So if you don't remember, oh yeah, I roughly remember how to remove, but I don't know the syntax for it, you just do .rem. It says remove. It will remove a string. It removes and returns, which means you can put this removed value in a variable or constant if you wanted to, and we'll actually try that. And it does it at the specified position. So okay, I'll press enter here. And what if I want to do messages.count -1. Now we could have put a number in here. And remember when we took a look at the description for remove, it also said that it returns a value, and because it returns a value, we can grab that and put it in a constant. So why don't we say let removed message equals this entire statement. But we're getting an error in here, and I mentioned we were going to get an error. That's because messages.removed is trying to change or mutate messages, and because we declared messages as a constant with let, it is immutable. Xcode, can you help me out? Click on the red ball. Sure thing. Xcode offers to make the change. Click fix. Let becomes var. The error goes away. Thanks, buddy. So if we go down here now and we say print, we can print out both removed message and messages to see what shows up down here. And type shift return to run the code. This shows us another way that we can leverage the print statement. You can just put values inside of a print statement separated by commas, and we see down here we have one element of the array, or we should say former element of the array, because that's what this .remove did. It's a method or a special function that applies to arrays. It removed the value at messages.count -1, which was the last value, which is the value at index 3. Remember 0 indexing, 0, 1, 2, 3. So messages was changed, and the value that was removed was used to initialize the constant removed messages. It shows up without the brackets because this is just a single string if we option click on top of it. But we see messages if we option click on top of it are a string with brackets around it to show that it's an array. And that's why we have the whole array. And the whole array down here no longer has fabulous that's you because we removed it. Nice. So we just removed an element and we saw that we could remove at a particular value. What about adding an element? There are a lot of ways to add elements to an array. The most common thing you'll want to do is to add an element at the end of an array, and there's an append function for that. So if we say messages.append, it asks us for a new element, and it remembers, hey, you're asking to append to messages, which is a string array, so you need to pass in a new string here. So we can press enter. You can put in any value, which is a string or a string literal. I'll say, you are a legend. Press enter. If we print messages here, shift enter, we see at the end, you are a legend. Now there are other ways we can add values here too. One of the ways is to use the plus sign to add values to an array, but you want to pay attention to how you do this. So we can say messages equals messages plus, and then we can put in whatever we want to do. But normally you might think, oh, I can just put in a string. So if we want to say, you Swifty, I'm going to get an error. And the reason I'm going to get an error is remember what we learned in the previous section. You can only provide operations on similar types. So what is you Swifty? This is a string. So what is messages? Messages is an array of string types. Now, an array of strings is considered to be different from a single string. So the way that we can get around this are a few ways. One is we can just go ahead and do append. Another thing that we could do is we could put brackets around this single element. And what we've done now by putting brackets around it is we've created an array with just one element in it. But now we're adding a string array to a string array. Swift says that's cool. Type is the same. It'll let us do it. If we do a shift enter, this is going to work. And we can see it shows the correct value if we print out messages. And in fact, I'm not getting errors here. I'm not sure why I didn't reset the uSwifty up here. I'll do a stop and restart, and we'll see that that'll clear out. Again, we just saw another quirk in Xcode. And so let's show one more technique. You can create another array and add it to your first array. So let's try this out by creating a new constant named newMessages equal square brackets because it's an array. And let's add 2 happy elements in here. You make me smile, and I think you're magic. Now we can take messages and add messages to newMessages. Press enter. Print messages. So newMessages still exists, but now at the end of the messages array, we have a copy of all of the elements that are in newMessages. Looking good. And by the way, there's another way to do shorthand when you want to add a value to a variable. I'll copy this element to show you, command / to comment it out, paste in here. I can simply say plus equal. Plus equal is the same thing as saying take the value on the left-hand side and add it to this value. So I'll run this with a shift return. We'll see this clears out, so it definitely executes, and it works the exact same way. So now that we've experimented with what we want to do here, let's see how we can apply this in our code. And here's your challenge. So I want you to modify your You Are Awesome project. I want you to create an array of strings that's named messages to hold some inspiring messages. Modify the function message button pressed so that the first time the show message button is clicked, the first element in the messages array shows in message label. And then each additional time show message is pressed, the next element in the array shows in the message label. Now when all the elements have been shown, the next click should restart at the first element in the messages array. An extra bonus if you've written code so that if you modify the code to add or remove elements in the messages array, the rest of your code should work unmodified. So think about the questions you want to answer. How do you keep track of the current message being shown? What scope do you use for this value? And what scope do you need for your messages? So pause here, give it a shot, and unpause. Pause! And we're back. And so I could retype the messages array in my project, but I'm just going to highlight this, Command C to copy it, and then I'm going to get back into my project. And if you don't know, the shortcut is Command $. That's the key just above the tab. That will flip through open windows in Xcode. And I'm going to paste this statement right at the top of message button pressed. And so since this messages array exists inside of message button pressed, we say that its scope is local to this function. Could I have declared it with class-wide scope? I could have, but I don't need this outside of this function. So this is a great place for it. And here's another tip. If you press return after the commas in an array, the next element in an array will format just under the one above it. Now, even though this takes up more space, I think it makes your code more readable. This will be the default if you press enter after a comma when you type in code for your project, but the playground doesn't do this formatting automatically. Now, you can ignore this yield message up here. It's just Xcode saying, hey, you just declared a value, but you haven't used it yet. Hang in there, Xcode. We're about to. So now what I want to do is I want to take the first element that I have here, and I want to put it inside of my message label.txt. So I'm going to put the code to do this just underneath where I declare messages. And in fact, I don't need this print message anymore. That was just while we were testing and learning a little bit about coding, so I'm going to delete it. And then I'm going to type in message label.txt equals messages bracket. And now if we wanted to start with the very first element, we would put a 0 in here. But remember what we did with our images. We created a separate value called image number to keep track of the current image that we're showing. So why don't we do the same thing and create a value called message number, and we'll use that to hold the index value in the array for the next message that we want to show. And so now let's go up under image number, and we'll say var message number equals, and we'll start out with 0 because we're 0 indexed on our array, and that'll be the first value here. And so instead of saying messages equal messages 0, we'll say messages equal message number. And the rest of our code is going to be very similar to what we did with our image number. So we'll take message number, we'll add it to 1, and in fact, why don't we use this technique that I showed you where we say message number plus equals 1. That's the same as message number equals message number plus 1. And then we'll say if message number equals, and to use that bonus technique in here, sure, we could have put in 4, which is the number of elements in the array, but instead we'll put in messages.count. So if we add or subtract values in our arrays, this will still work unmodified. So if the if condition is true, what we want to do is we want to set message number back to 0, just as we set image number back to 0 when we were working with image numbers. Now we also see this yellow line with the yield sign warning, and this is just Xcode telling us, hey, I noticed that you created messages as a variable. Since you haven't mutated it, you should turn this into a constant. That's not a bad idea, Xcode, so we'll click on the yield sign and select fix, and Xcode changes var to let, and the yellow warning goes away. This is looking good. Let's build and run, my Swifty friend. And here we go. Nice! Let's go ahead and press show message, show message, show message. Looking good. Show message one more time. Before the moment of truth, when we see if we go back to element number 0, let's put in a breakpoint right here in the message label line. We'll hop back to the simulator, click show message again, our breakpoint pauses, and let's take a look at what we have down here in the variable pane. We see a variable for image name, and we see one that says messages, which says that it's a string in brackets, which means a string array. Hey, and it even says it's got 4 values. And hey again, it's got an exposure triangle. Let's go ahead and click on that, and whoa, it shows us what the actual 4 values are. Cool. What happens if we click and expose what's under self? Oh, we see everything which is a class-wide property that includes image number, which is currently 4, and message number, which we properly set back to 0. Now look at some of the other things that we can do. If we hover our cursor right over where it says messages, we get this little pop-up which says that there are 4 values. Now the I for quick look isn't that interesting because it says 4 values, but the I with a circle in it for information is actually really cool. We can actually see what those 4 values are along with their indexes. So lots of really interesting ways we can begin to interrogate our code and see what exactly is happening in our code to our variables, to our constants at the time when we paused. Xcode is a little quirky. The pop-ups that we just saw won't happen in all situations, but it's another thing you can try out when you've paused with breakpoints. So now remember, the step into icon will go to the next line, and I'll press again, it'll go to the next line. In the line above, I've incremented message number by 1, and you see down here it shows the variable message number is now 1. Click step into again, it jumps down here to the next line, which is this let image name line. I'm going to click on the resume button so my code starts to execute again. I'm back in the simulator pops back up. We see you are awesome is showing in there. Again, that's indexed at 0, but we also increased our message number to 1 to get ready for the next time we click the button. And if I click show message again, it stops at this breakpoint that I'd set. I'm going to get rid of the breakpoint, so I'll just drag it out of the gutter and let go. It disappears. I'll click on the resume button again. And we can keep clicking on the show message button to celebrate how ultra fantastic you are. So we learned a lot in this video. We learned how to use Swift Playgrounds, the REPL, to see the results of our code execute in real time. We used Swift Playground to explore code and try out some new concepts. We learned specifically about arrays. We learned how to declare arrays, how to add values to arrays, how to remove values in arrays, how to count the number of elements in arrays. We learned a whole bunch of shortcuts, and even more cool stuff we can do when we pause with breakpoints. And we applied what we learned in our You Are Awesome code, so now we have different messages changing and different images changing. Your app is starting to look awesome, and you are awesome. I hope you're feeling really good about your skills, Swifter. Keep at it.